A few. So that is fission fusion. Fission is to go away, fusion is to fuse again, to come together. And these fission fusion societies, both in the human realm, and that's what Mr. Georgiev says, they are prone to intra-species, intra-group killings. Now, but this is all not carved in stone. This changes, especially with humans. Humans, in the old days, they were killers, almost like the meerkats, but today's humans, they look terrible to us, especially on television and in Syria and other places, but they're nice people compared with our ancestors. On the other hand, genocide is not foreign to the human species from an evolutionary point of view. So it's not something that is completely out of human nature, but it can be explained by the very same concepts that we have been hearing about, and that is a very sad state of affairs. But he gives some convincing examples. They are so easy and trivial, but nevertheless, one has to take notice of them. Consider, for example, the situation of the European colonial armies that first encountered the local populations in America, Africa, Asia, or Australia. The benefit of using violent aggression against the indigenous populations were enormous, taking away their land, their possessions, and even their people to use as slaves. The costs of the colonists' aggression were minimal. Armed with rifles, they could quickly kill large numbers of indigenous individuals at little or no physical risk to themselves. Moreover, the indigenous populations looked different and spoke a different language. It must have been quite easy for the colonists to find a psychological, political, historical, or religious justification for their violence without suffering any consequences. These unusually high benefit cost ratios for violent aggression against people from other countries are rare or non-existent in animals, which may explain why large-scale aggression toward conspecifics is absent in animals, with the possible exception of chimpanzees, our close relatives, and some species of ants, happily not our close relatives, and termites that stage wars against other colonies, destroying or taking away their resources and enslaving the workers. I mean, this is a trivial explanation, but in science, the easiest explanations, if they cannot be refuted, are the best ones. That's the Occam's law, I think, the razor sort of thing. So it must not necessarily be a bad explanation. Well, yeah. Now let's come to the history and to the future of homicide. There was a sensational book, I think in 2011, by Stephen Pinker about the better angels of our nature, about the decrease of violence in human history. That really has revolutionized thinking for many, many, many people. And Pinker himself says that he was somehow surprised about his findings. He does, at that time, he did not consider himself an optimist in terms of human nature or human development. But he became a little bit more optimistic writing this book and finding all this evidence. And now he's just recently published a new book about enlightenment. And it seems he's getting more enthusiastic about our species by the year. And in 2011, he had this finding. He just brought together from a million sources. And I've read all the critical stuff that I could get about his book, and there were a lot of critical reviews, and there were a lot of people who said, oh, he's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong. But there was nothing that convinced me. They didn't have strong arguments against it. So I'm somehow, I must admit, I'm still a Pinker believer, and as a Pinker believer, I believe, together with a lot of people nowadays, that human beings were more violent with every 1,000 years that you go back in history. Today we are in 2000 and a few years. In the year 1000 and a few years, the homicide rates, they were not 6 or 7 per 100,000. They were maybe 60 or maybe 100, maybe 600. And 1,000 years before that, when Jesus Christ was born, the human society was more violent. And 1,000 years before that, even more so, and even more so, and even more so. Now, I cannot give an oath on that, and there must be a lot of differentiation to be applied. But basically, you can probably say that, and you find archaeological evidence of societies which were really killing each other by making your skull into pieces. And that was normal in a way. That was what we see as gruesome in this Polish movie. That was more or less like what you did all day. And now Pinker tries to explain what made the human being more peaceful and less violent by the centuries and by the millennia. And he says, well, state-making was a bloody profession, but state-making monopolized violence, and even though the rulers of the states, they were killing large amounts of people, it was never so much as the people themselves would kill without the discipline of a ruler. The ruler was interested in the preservation of demography for his own reasons. He needed slaves, he needed money, he needed taxes, etc. And so the state was not as bad as some sociologists believe it was. It was bad and bloody and unjust and repressive and xenophobic, but it was not bad in terms of violence. And bureaucracy was another step forward. When you have a good bureaucracy, the Foucauldian discipline, then you have a way of ruling over people without applying direct force. That was different from the Middle Ages, when you had to extract the surplus value by brute force. You had to send people who were beating the people until they were paying taxes. That was getting better and better with bureaucracies. So then came the famous Enlightenment, and came belief systems, ethical systems that helped a lot too. And the process of civilization, think of Norbert Elias's far-sighted perspective. People became more far-sighted in their behavior, anticipating reactions from other people, becoming more clever, more diplomatic in their behavior. And all this reduces violence. You're not short-tempered anymore, but in the process of civilization, people develop a far-sighted, long-term perspective that reflects on their behavior. You say, well, I will not hit him with a pen on his head today because he might still be mad half a year from now. So I will be more subtle and this is how intrigues and all these nice things develop, because they're substituting direct immediate aggression. So we will have to come to a certain end, and I will just say one thing. It looks as if these things are going pretty well, and even though we have this Latin American homicide problem at the moment, these things can be solved. Much of the world society will become ever more refined and more nice like Scandinavia. So there's no question in my mind and no question in his mind, Yuval Noah Harari's mind with his best-selling book Homo Deus, that things will develop in a good way and we will become ever more sensitive and inclusive. You can also cite Peter Singer, the great philosopher, with his increasing circles of inclusion. We are now including the great apes. Peter Singer is one of the originators of the Great Apes Project that wants a United Nations declaration for fundamental rights for big apes. The freedom of liberty, the freedom, the right to health, and the freedom of torture, prohibition of torture. All these, among other things, should be rights for other great apes. We are also great apes, in a sense. And other great apes should also profit from these rights. So, inclusion. Look, when you had the Spartans, the Helots, who were free in a way, were also not free, they didn't count. That was 7/10 of the population. They simply did not count. Women did not count. Children did not count. They had no rights. Slaves had no rights. So, in the beginning, only a few people were we. Now, today, we live in a time when we don't have slaves anymore. So the ex-slaves, they are belonging to us. They also form the we, the society. Women suddenly have voting rights, 1917 in some countries. In Switzerland, the women gained voting rights in 1992. But so now they have them. So they also belong to us. It's a big inclusion. The workers, they're also included. Young people have rights. So everybody has rights. And now in the future, the great apes will have rights. And our little dogs might also have rights. And there are Kimlicka and Davidson with Zoopolis that will distribute citizen rights to all kinds of animals, to wild animals, to our pet animals, to the slaughterhouse animals, etc., etc. So there's a lot of inclusion going on and a lot of sensitivity, and that is very good. But then comes a little problem that is with artificial intelligence and robots and rationalization of work. The working class, they will be the not working class in the future. There will only be few workers left, and few people are needed for the economy. There are few people needed to produce, there are lots of people needed to consume, but there are certainly not 9 billion poor people you needed to do nothing, which they will practically do. There is no way of making everybody rich, except if André Gortz was right with his ways to paradise in the 1980s, detaching income from work and productivity, etc. But that's a very complicated question. Now, what we will have in the future is we will have this beautiful inclusion society with little homicides. Everything will be like Scandinavia. You can already prepare to sit outside, tear down the fences here before the houses. We don't need guaritas anymore. No, there will be no problem. There will be no homicides anymore. But the problem is, there will be something like 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 billion people unemployed with no money. They will live in the third world, and well, the third world will also be the first world, like Sao Paulo will. But there will be pockets where gigantic masses of unemployed, uneducated people with hardly any resources will live. Why don't they have resources? Well, because there will be a competition for resources, like water, like air to breathe, like education. And there will be no reason to educate all these dispossessed masses. And so I call these people the new helots, like the helots, the helotes in ancient Greece, in ancient Sparta, in the first millennium BC. They belonged to the state. And they were different from the coming helotes, they were doing serious work. They were feeding the Spartan elite. But the new helotes, they will be something like these old helotes. They were without rights, but they had to work. They did not belong to a specific individual, but to the state. They could be freed, but there was no need to free them. And they were periodically raided and terrorized, and permanently terrorized. Once a year, the Spartan people would declare war on their servants, so they would not break a divine law killing them. And they ritually killed their own, not all of them, of course, but the strongest one and the most promising ones that were likely to organize uprisings, pétés, pésols, and other kind of partidos. And they would be killed periodically, and that was a very efficient way of keeping Spartan rule alive. There were so and so many uprisings of helotes and attempts to improve their lot, but none of them was successful because of this fantastic way of social control. Give them no rights and raid them, terrorize them, kill their leaders, and make it impossible for them to articulate themselves, to organize themselves. And that worked. And that will have to happen. I don't see another way, except some genius like Harari comes with another idea. So, in my vision, there will be an upper class of the world that might be 10%, 20, 30, maybe, I don't know how many percent. And this upper class will give rights to great apes, but also to other animals. Will be a society of perfect inclusion and little homicides. But then there will be the masses of the dispossessed, and I don't see what we can do with them, and other than treat them bad. And don't give them education, don't give them citizen rights, and try to divide them, to instigate conflicts between them, among them, so they would have their intergroup conflicts and intra-group conflicts, and somehow then shielding. So I see two worlds coming up. A Scandinavian world that will exist and that will be very beautiful, and we should all apply for tickets that we get into the Scandinavian world, because the other world will not be so nice, and there will be a lot of homicides, and that might go back in history to the Meerkat sort of level of killings. So that's my prospect for the future, and I hope I'm wrong, and everybody will get a ticket for the Scandinavian.
Se alguém tiver alguma pergunta que queira fazer, in the context of killing.
Professor, this future, which seems rather bleak, do you see any parallel with this description of the future with the situation of the Palestinians in Israel, for example? I know it's very controversial, but I want to...
Yeah, well, what you see, first of course I have to say all of what I have to say, that I'm not an expert in the Near East, nor in the Far East, and I will say all that. And then I will say that I have met at a conference a Palestinian scholar who had a very interesting experience of taking Palestinians to Auschwitz on an education trip to Auschwitz, so as to discuss questions of xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, etc. And she had decided, I think she was an East Jerusalem Palestinian, and she had decided to get out of Israel because of a certain phenomenon. And that phenomenon was when she was wanting to write her thesis, she wanted to write about some aspect of what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the defeat, and more or less the beginning of the tragic situation that perdures until today. And then in her university, they said, no, you cannot use the word Nakba. And she said, well, then I cannot be a scholar at a university where I cannot use that word. That word exists, and it exists for many people and has a certain meaning, and you can write the word. So what she was complaining about was that there was a regulated speech that aimed evidently at preventing the formation of a discourse on an academic level about contrary experiences, diverse experiences. And then she was telling more things that I did not know. One was that Palestinians have different access rights, different rights of domicile. They have different passports in different colors. And with each passport, there's a different thing associated, different set of rights. But you never have complete rights. So this is what I would call a denizen. Denizens in British law, I don't know if that exists until today, but it used to exist. Denizens were citizens who had only partial citizen rights. And then you could be a half citizen or a 2/3 citizen or a 1/13 citizen. So you would be a denizen. You would have your own set of rights, but you would not be a citizen in the sense of a citizen. So it seems to me that this differentiation of rights is a thing with a certain future. Because when you can do that, and you can occupy a territory for 50 years or longer, and you can divide the population in different groups, and maybe then you can have a police of the occupation, people that polices in the interest of the occupiers, the occupied. That sounds like divide et impera, very old Roman, very wise Machiavellian sort of recommendation. And so I think the differentiation of rights, the attribution of differentiated rights, and the intertwined social control using indirect rule was an old method of the British colonial system. The British colonial system functioned because, I mean, they had governed sort of like half of the surface of the earth, or maybe more. And how could such a few people on a small island in the North Sea, how could they ever dominate half of the earth, millions and billions of people. Well, by indirect rule. Of course, you had to have superior weaponry and superior bureaucracy, and they had both. The Indians are still thankful for the bureaucracy. They're still trying to get to that level. But what they have in India is at least the idea how a bureaucracy could function. And they are grateful to the Indians. And in Ghana, I've been in Ghana, I've been in other places, and they're grateful for these aspects of colonialism. So, you have to have indirect rule, you have to separate one group from the other, you have to maybe do something that they fight each other like Hamas and Al-Fatah. So there are, I would say yes, everywhere where you have a successful situation of domination, you have similar methods. And you might be in favor, you can say it's necessary, etc., you might be against it. But when you look at it analytically, as an observer from outer space, you will see very many similarities in Machiavellism. You don't have to go to Palestine, you can go to North Sinai, where the Egyptian army is trying to get control over large parts of the population, and you will see that they employ very similar tactics. There are short-term tactics, long-term tactics. So I have to say yes, I do see some promise for the future in that system.
Earlier you were talking about the homicide rates, and it said that when it gets to 20 by the 100,000 inhabitants, people start talking about it in society. How did you come up with that number?
Well, I had been thinking of New York. I think New York had a rate of 30 when they started the turnaround. When William Breton was chief commissioner of police, and when they had all these mechanisms put in place that really succeeded in getting crime down. So that was 30, and I remember the time before 30, that was in the 1970s, I think. I was in New York, and there were lots of places where you couldn't go. You couldn't use the tube. You couldn't go to the Washington Square Park. Later on, around the year 2000, I went to Washington Square Park to buy my drugs, and it worked fine. And so things have changed radically and beautifully in a way. And even police violence has decreased. The police had been killing people at a rate that was preoccupying. Today, the police still kill, as we all know, but the rate has gone down considerably. It might be going up right now. Over the 1990s, it had gone down considerably. So from this New York experience, I would say 20 would be a threshold, 30 would be a threshold. You cannot take it by the exact number, but it's sort of like this. The society gets in disarray, people get very nervous, you have a quasi-statistical perception of what is going on. And at a certain point, people say, no, this cannot go on. Okay, I think we've come, it's only the first day. We have 4 more days, and we've come to a certain point.
So, thank you, Sebastian, for this lecture. Tomorrow is drugs or prison?
Tomorrow will be the prison.
Prison. So we have option is in the menu for tomorrow. We have homicide, prison, and drugs. So it's a full deal, right? Thank you again. I think that we can all benefit from today's lecture in the sense of trying to understand how to prevent homicide, how to think homicide in theoretical grounds for myself, I think that homicide prevention should be concentrated on mostly young males, and that's pretty much a criminal policy that should think about more, right? And it's always like lost in this kind of between the theology, the anthropological perspective, and then some kind of critical criminology that just say no, it cannot be connected with more profound, but maybe it has. It's too much evidence. One thing that struck me is what characterized this lecture on Vienna 2018 is probably that you haven't mentioned the idea of the nuclear paradigm, but the fact that there are nuclear weapons, right? And that's strange because meerkats don't have nuclear weapons. So you have the same kind of anthropological explanation and comprehensive, but at the same time we have a way of killing everybody, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of interspecific killing never had in the past the possibility of extermination
Of all species.
of all species, and that's really, and we have to consider both ways. I mean, maybe this was kind of deterrence that kept wars killing less, but at the same time, it's the potential of killing everybody. So, and a couple of other things that just struck me here. You mentioned the study of Igarapé, right? 2% of the streets. And the problem is that, I know if you read the latest book on Robert Sampson, The Great American City, and he talks like about the distribution of crime on the streets. And the problem is that it's sometimes, if you attack these 2% streets, that can spread.
Yeah,
You have the
displacement,
displacement,
you have
etc., etc. So that there are a lot of questions, and one thing that your lecture today remind me once again is how difficult it is to do criminology again, right? Because you have to think all things considered, and this kind of broad analysis really are much needed, I think, right? In the common sessions and conferences, everybody's so on their subjects, right? And we're not taking the big picture. I think that you brought a huge picture for us today, and there are a lot of on to talk about. So thank you for that. That was beautiful, well explained.
Well, I thank you again for your beautiful palestra no começo no fim. And I thank you all, and we'll hopefully see each other tomorrow.
Yeah, obrigado.